Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. This week on the show, we're going to get into one of my, I think, favorite topics, and that is biocultural collections and interesting museum pieces, and explore a little bit about how these artifacts relate to our health and to our food systems. Our guest today is Aurora Prehn. She's the Biocultural Collection Manager at the William L. Brown Center at Missouri Botanical Garden, located in St. Louis, Missouri. She completed her bachelor's in anthropology and environmental studies at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then completed her master's in ethnobotany at the University of Kent and the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. She's interested in looking at local food culture, health, and environment. She's also undertaken research in Georgia, where she spent 3.5 months investigating the biocultural relationships between Georgians, their landscape, and grapes. She's also been researching the tea and teaware objects of the Economic Botany Collection at Kew since 2019. So thanks so much for coming on the show, Aurora. It's really great to see you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I love your podcast and what you do for our field.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I want to touch on some of your more recent work first. Let's start with tea and teacups and all of the different things that go into the history of tea consumption. And maybe you can just start by telling us a little bit about this collection, where you found these tea artifacts.
At Q's collection or in the
Yeah, at Kew.
I first got into the collection on a tour during my master's program in 18 or 19. I think it was around like January 2019. And of course I asked if I could see the tea items, and because I knew that they must have some. It's England, of course they must be. It's a historic collection, it's Kew. And they did. They have about 325 items then at the collection. It's now over 400. And I was blown away. It is full of items that you only read about. And prior to starting that master's, I was working in the specialty tea and botanical trade in the US. So a lot of this was very fresh in my mind. I was a tea taster and educator there, and taking the ethnobotanical lens in a lot of the classes. And so a lot of this was fresh in my mind. And, we have Q has I say we as Missouri and Q. I'm working with both of them. At Q, a clay, Tibetan teapot that is, of good size, that's not cracked, not damaged, handles intact, a wooden lid that's used for Tibetan tea. So a lot of the images that are shown in the interview you had with Dr. Robbie Hart in the Brown Center, those metal teapots you see, they used to make them brass and copper and clay of different materials. So there's a clay one from 1850s, and they also had different pu'er tea bricks and black tea bricks and cakes there, and some of the names of some of the plant explorers and traders and collectors. Twinings, Ford and Mason, some companies were there, and I just found it fascinating. I knew the historical context. I spoke with the curator, Mark Nesbitt, at the time. I was like, "Do you know what you have here?" And I was like, there are people that would be dying to try some of these teas. Of course, they're not going to drink the collection. That's always a question we ask. Have you tried any of the teas? And the answer is no, not at the time. If we would do that, we would link it up with chemistry, and we would do it. It's a destructive sampling at this point. And we would definitely need to do it, not just to fulfill our own capacities, as much as I really want to. And there were jars of tea types I haven't seen before. And working in industry for a few years in the specialty organic sector, seeing a wide range of different types and different origins and different genetics grown in unique places, and I was still seeing some that were unfamiliar. And it became quite clear after we hosted a few workshops right up before COVID happened, and at Kew, and the London Tea History Association, or Tea History Association, they've recently dropped the London, and scholars and industry folk, and the types that I was curious about, they've also aren't familiar with at all. So it means that it is fallen out of manufacture or use or trade in the West,
Yeah.
or in areas where these people have familiarity. So it was really, it was very fascinating. And no one has taken work, the research into this sub collection of the EBC in the last 100 years. And I just really wanted to dive into it. So it definitely became a project with lockdown and being separate from the collection for 2.5 years almost, that I just latched onto, and I just kept working at, and I held on to that project. It's definitely a COVID project.
That's great. Well, I mean, I'm a big, I love tea, and I know it comes in many different forms. So we think about loose leaf tea, you're talking about tea bricks as well. And I think when we think about today, the common way that we may prepare tea is in just a regular ceramic tea vessel, or just directly into a mug. But you were mentioning these other objects. So in this collection, there are clay, metal. Are there also vessels to store the tea, or what kinds of other objects are there? Yeah.
Right. So there's about just over 400. It's coming from all 6 continents, and they're mostly tea leaves. So the difference with this collection, biocultural collection or economic botany collection, versus an artistic collection, is that it's mainly made of plants or for plant use. Especially each one of the collections, of course, different. At Q's has been around. The garden is, is Aurora Botanical Garden. As part of the Rote family, moved to the government 1840, first director 1841. Museum opened of vegetable products, which became the Economic Botany Collection. It's on September 20th, 1847, and it's been at Kew and growing continuously since. Wow. So that's a remarkable feat for any institution or collection or anything like that. So what they collected at the time were items of anything. They were collecting, bringing in anything, soliciting donations, and all of his connections, actually, William Jackson Hooker, Q's first director, and they're collecting pretty much everything that they could. And the first guidebook came out in 1855, and the tea collection there, and sets up his intention for the collection, which is to reflect what was going on. And this is just one thing that, as I got into it, it really solidified my interest in this sub collection, is that they really actively brought in everything. They brought in the Chinese leaves, they brought in everything that could be found on the market. And then, as if you know anything about tea, the European observation of native tea to India being used in the Upper Assam Valley by Singpho peoples in the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, and that whole story. But if you overlay that with the Q's collection story, the museum is really coming out when Indian grown tea and Chinese grown tea, and of the genetics being grown in both places and being moved around, the wheels were already turning on that. So William Jackson Hooker collected both. He collected Indian tea, he collected Chinese tea, not because one was superior, but he brought in both to compare, because people wanted to see this new plant and what it looked like being grown in India, and what Chinese tea being grown in India looked like. And Darjeeling comes onto the scene as a growing area. So he brought in both, and he brought in Indian tea grown with both stock. And you actually can, because they also were trying to figure out, because for a long time, even though we know the truth behind it is that tea is from the same plant, and it's the processing that makes the categories and not different species. Be surprised at how long we've, as a species, knew this and denied it and debated it. And you can see this kind of over time. And so Hooker brought in everything to reconsider what's going on, what's
happening to tea.
how is
Well,
related?
I'm sure many of our listeners actually aren't super familiar with how tea is made, and how you can get green tea versus a black tea versus like a tea brick. Could
Yeah,
you break that down for us a little bit? Just because the
certainly.
everyday tea consumer, like, what are we actually dealing with when we look at like green versus black versus like, you know, English breakfast or, all these
Yeah,
different tea types and varieties, and Earl
definitely.
Grey, which is one of my favorites as well. Like
Right.
how do we get to those products?
Yeah, so tea, as I'm talking about, is Camellia sinensis, variety sinensis, or variety samica, commonly known as big leaf or small leaf. So small leaf typically comes from, or people join us, is the Chinese leaf, and the large leaf is from India or up into Myanmar, Thailand, and Yunnan province of China, and it does have a very large leaf. So side by side, they look almost like they're not related in some cases. Um, so it is one plant, and the processing um, makes the different tea categories and tea types. So the degree of oxidation is how people commonly break down categories of tea. The first being green. You want to pick it, apply heat, either dry heat or wet heat. So it's a kill green step, to kill the enzymes in the leaf, or denature them so they don't brown. What I'm talking about here is like if you slice an apple, or how quickly it browns, right? So that's oxidation happening on a
Mhm.
chemical level. So
So if you heat
green,
the leaf, it doesn't brown. It
yeah,
stays green. Okay.
yeah. So it's just like if you blanch spinach or broccoli, right? Boiling in water, it can stay green in your fridge. It won't start browning or get emerald green color. So that's the idea. That's how you need to make green tea. It's actually made relatively quickly compared to others. Then the other categories in the order are white and yellow. Some people invert those. Sometimes it's green, yellow, white, or green, white, yellow. Oolong, which is a semi-oxidized category. Black tea is a fully oxidized category. And then there's dark tea, or what we call in the West dark tea. Okay. And pu'er can fit depending on the stage and the camps that you're in. It can be green tea or it will be a dark tea there. So those are the 6 categories. And within those categories, I call each of those categories kind of like an umbrella.
Mhm.
Underneath each category, you have a list of different tea types. And that's the difference between the curly one, the flat one, the one that looks a little bit more lime green, the one that looks really dark, the one that's rolled into a ball that smells like jasmine or something like that. And there's different names. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of a really long history, a lot of long tradition of some of these teas, and some of them can be brand new.
Mm.
And the confusing part is that a lot of it can be marketing. When the farther away that it travels,
Yeah.
the Western market, a lot of it is very confusing, to be honest. And as soon as you do something 2 or more outside of like a scenting or something like that, it's a tea blend. And then you're
Okay.
bringing in the energetics, the history, and different processes for each ingredient that you have. So Earl Grey that you mentioned is scented with bergamot oil. It's from a
Yeah.
citrus, a rind of a citrus. Um, so there's smoky Earl Grey, there's London fog that includes it. There's all of these names of
Different
different.
oils infused into it. Yeah.
So there's teas and tea blends, and you actually, from tying it back to the historic collection, you do really see this. So this is
Mhm.
what Q's first director was collecting in the beginning, and some of our most interesting teas today are some of those original teas that he collected that were published in the 1855 guide.
Wow.
Um, and he lists them. You can tell it's a category of plants that he liked, that people would find interesting or that they know about. And he was selling that guide. He put in a very detailed list of what was in the tea cabinets, and a little bit of explanation. In one publication, it says it tastes great. They tried them before they put them in the cabinets.
That's
So
great.
it's fun. So you see these names come through, and that's a challenge historically, because by now all the leaves are brown and the names and the grades change, and sometimes the tea grades and the size of the leaf or the quality of the leaf and the name of what it is interchangeable. Sometimes they're the same.
Mm.
All of that evolves over time, and
Yeah,
that makes it tricky to
changes
study.
with flavor. So going back to the preparation with green tea, you're quickly heating it. Is it the case that for black tea that you're just letting it kind of oxidize? You don't do anything to it after you harvest it, or is there a processing step?
Yeah, there you do. You usually pick leaves. You can't pick them all year round. You pick them in flushes when the burst of spring and the leaves come out. It's a flush. And right
Okay.
now we're definitely in the spring flush time right now. So everyone in
Okay.
the industry is frantically in buying time right now. It's been going on for like a month and a half too. And so you do pick young leaves, you let them wilt, which evaporates some of the water out.
Mhm.
And you don't want to bruise the green because, of course, you don't want it to prematurely oxidize. And for black, you still don't want to bruise them when you don't want them, but you let them wilt and then you roll them and you do crush the leaf. You do the opposite. You
So that
crush.
releases the enzymes to
Yep,
help them oxidize. Okay.
all the juice and all the oxides, and then it starts browning like right away from the
Okay.
outside into the leaf. And the length you do that, if you do that inside or outside, the temperature, humidity of your room, all you can imagine. There's so many factors in making tea, so many variables. And for black tea, you can totally tell if it was oxidized in a cold room or oxidized in a uh, warm room,
Hmm.
like in the tropics. You can tell, like, there's nothing but hot and humid, right? When
Yeah.
you do that in like a 65-degree room when it's really dry out, it's going to make a difference. And you can tell that. And that's becomes the terroir and the um, tea. Tea industry falls on the coattails of the specialty coffee and definitely
Yeah.
falls in the wine industry. There's parallels to both.
The
And so
tea tasting. Yeah.
use the word terroir, but it's definitely the taste of place. Like consumers around the world, tea tasters, you can tell if a black tea, the genetics of the plant is if it's variety Samica or Sinensis. You can tell what season it was picked in. You can tell where it's
Wow.
from. It's a very much reflective
You
leaf.
can taste all that. You can taste that chemistry. That's an amazing skill. Like I am definitely not such a connoisseur. I would like to learn though. And then one last question I have is white or yellow tea. So we have heating for green, rolling for black. Where does white and yellow
Yeah.
tea fall in?
So the key step for each category, I'd say for a green, it's again like that quick fire. For
Hmm.
white tea, you just let it wither till it's dried essentially.
Oh,
So
okay.
withering is the key thing. So some people think that that's the rawest form, like
But it's not crushed. It's just let to, okay.
so yeah. And it's also the place some of the most expensive teas. It's because white tea, the two main types is a silver needle or a needle tea, where it's literally just the unopened buds,
Oh my goodness.
which is incredibly high labor costs and
Mhm.
costs you see reflected as an end consumer. And then a white peony, which is one or two leaves and a bud. So it's just the young material dried. So you get lots of sweetness and the floral notes of spring. So you
Wow.
just let that dry. So either way, it's also a good candidate for blending different floral teas. So you see that often in rose and peach and things like that. Um, yellow tea was a category that was made by accident. So they were making green tea, put in a basket with a lid on it, made a pile of the leaves still warm, like out of a wok,
Uh-huh.
China. And it kept cooking in a different way, in like a warm pot heat pile. And so like
Mm.
smothering is like, because it came out as the leaf was a different color and then the cup was a different color. So that added step, that key step makes it yellow. And then oolong is semi-oxidized, so it's a very artisanal category. They all are, but you have green looking oolongs and you have fully oxidized oolongs. It's really
Mhm.
the one in straddling the middle. So there are some generalities that you can have with the spectrum of tea of this category spectrum, as I say. So the first half I just mentioned will have lots of green, fresh green, fresh grass, roasted chestnut, florals. And as you oxidize, you get more fruit and you get more earthiness, and you get more maltiness, you get some sweetness coming out, because as you know, if any cook will know, is that when you apply heat and you roast a vegetable, what happens? It gets sweet. You're caramelizing the sugars and
Yeah.
that are present. So it really kind of evolves. And then and so black tea, as I mentioned, you bruise it, expose all the juices, it oxidizes fully. there's shaping in there for all of these, and you dry it. And then dark tea is a fermented tea. It's a
Fermented. Okay.
post fermented tea. So there are a few traditional tea types out there, and and there's each one of these is a whole conversation. But that's the last category. So in that spectrum, you get very light, fragile leaves. So you want kind of low temperatures and short infusion times for greens, whites, yellows, and then a little bit hotter and a little bit longer for the more oxidized leaves. Everything you do from when you pick it to when you dry it makes the category and type.
Wow. So there's this huge, I mean, a huge diversity of products coming from a single plant species. And around the single plant species, we have a huge diversity in tools that enable its processing and consumption. And that's, I guess, what you see in this economic botany collection or this biocultural collection is a mix of both the materials that are consumed and the vessels and tools that we use to prepare them. That's fascinating. So that's different than what we would see in a classic, a museum, a typical museum, right? That we
Yeah.
have kind of both sides of that coin. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
the plant-based artifacts are tough to maintain.
Yeah, I can imagine they might
Are.
degrade over time. Yeah.
They degrade over time, and especially if it was used, you have use wear, which is not wrong. It just presents a challenge. And there are handbooks and dialogues out there for conservators and curators and how to manage plant-based artifacts. But and also bugs love plants.
Yeah. An insect is like an herbarium's, worst enemy. And I'm guessing the same for biocultural collections. Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
have bug
Yeah.
traps that check regularly. I have mouse traps out. I've caught a few.
Oh.
Sorry to all the vegans out there that loves animals, but that's that the herbarium zone is not where mice need to be.
Yeah. No, no, no. You can destroy the samples. Yeah.
So they sometimes, yeah, they come in. So, plant-based object-based collections, especially at Kew and in Missouri, we want tea leaves and tea wares and even processing equipment. So we want not just the end result, we want the process as well. And that's incredibly telling. And if you or anybody knows about any process, I mean, that's going to involve more plants. It's not just tea. So, there are woven trays and equipment that's used with other plants to make the process. So just looking at the end result doesn't tell the full story. So at Missouri here, we have an established data standard, data minimum, and a standard we're trying to keep. And we don't just want the final result. So we're really growing our paper collection right now, and we have like amate beaters and tapa beaters, and we have some finished paper and tapa as well to kind of show it. But it's definitely something, that wider picture, that bigger story, as well as all of the materials and data comes with it. We want the full picture. So it's something that I'm looking at for both collections.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit more about biocultural collections in the context of what you're doing now at the Missouri Botanical Garden. So, and we've spoken about Kew, and Kew has this amazing economic botany collection. And for the listeners out there, you may recall an episode where I spoke with the director of Kew's biocultural collections, Dr. Mark Nesbitt, about his work on tonic water, which was a really fascinating book that he co-authored with Kem Walker. But now, Aurora, you're at Mobot, and the director there is also another former guest on the show, Robbie Hart, who shared with us some really fascinating tales of his research in the Himalayas and how to make yak butter tea, which also kind of segues into this episode.
Yep.
I have not yet tried yak butter tea. It's on my list of things I want to try at some point. But it comes from that brick basically that's brought up the mountain.
Yep.
And is, yeah. And would the tea brick be considered a fermented product? Is that kind of how it gloms together as a brick, or is that a different product?
Yeah, so it's not so it's compressed. So the
Okay.
liquor are made, it's kind of steamed and compressed into the shape.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's not always steamed, but uh it is pressed into that mold originally. So it's kind of a two parts to your question. And it's historically or present day, because present day um there's kind of two types of pu'er, a sheng pu'er or sheng pu, and a shu pu'er or shu pu. And a shang is a very young, very green leaf, very starts out as mao cha or a rough tea, or it's dried in the sun. It tastes delicious. But then they steam it, press into a cake, and that's shang pu'er. That's not aged yet. That's could be it's a pu'er, but a green pu'er that could be in the green category. Over time, it becomes a dark tea when it's aged, when it's vintage. It and there's a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about what's actually happens in the cake when it ages, right? And this is the tea that parallels with aging a wine, right? It definitely evolves with age. And then there's the shu pu'er, which was developed in the 1970s to replicate aged sheng pu'er, because it tastes delicious and people didn't want to wait 30 years to go for an aged sheng cake. So there's kind of two main types now. So all of the pu'er we see in the US market that comes out is this shu pu'er, or this pile fermented pu'er. So the bricks that Robbie was talking about historically were the sheng cakes. And as you mentioned, they go up out of Yunnan or out of Sichuan over the Tea Horse Road into Tibet, or Upper Yunnan or in Tibet, and they often follow the Tibetan diaspora. And on that journey, if you look at old photos, they're wrapped in bamboo husks. They're wrapped in, porous material on the back of a mule or a yak or person. Once you get up at high elevation, on that journey, it would evolve. It would change. It would start out as one thing, and it changed by the time it got to the markets up in the mountains. And so you could see a shu cake today. You could see a sheng cake, and the speed of transport makes it a different product. So it's a
Interesting.
very
Yeah.
great story of looking at the Tea Horse Road. There are people you can walk sections of it today. It was being used like a human transport trade route into Mao Zedong's era, and he insisted saying,
Wow.
we need to move past this and kind of put an end to it. So you can still find segments across Southwest China where the stones are smooth to like glass, of
Wow.
hooves and foot walking over it for centuries. And if you ever been to Yunnan or look at a topographical map, it is major valleys, the headwaters of major rivers going down the Mekong, the Yangtze, and huge valleys. I mean, it's the only way north is up the valley.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's not even for centuries; it's for millennia. I mean, of human movement. There's
This is
only
like one
so
of
many
the oldest forms of tea, but today, probably, I mean, would I be correct in saying this is the rarest form of tea because people just don't make that journey any longer of this, on foot? If the product actually develops fully on the journey, if we don't have people on that journey any longer in the same way.
It's just evolved into being in a different phase.
Different phase, okay.
There's a wonderful book, Puar, by Lasing Zong, out of University of Washington Press, and it summarizes everything about Puar, and I definitely encourage you to read it. But I would still say, I still argue that, I mean, it is still, of all the tea types out there, it is a very old one. It might be one of the oldest that we still have in that older form today. If it's not millennia, it is certainly evolved out of that. But so in the last few hundred years, it's been the same. Speaking to the other types in Q's collection, this one twisted tea type that we think might be gone. So it's one that has persisted, and why there's certain cultural value and use that has kept it around. So it's a different type. People still age it. You can age it in a cool low humidity or in a warm high humidity. So like difference of aging something in Seattle versus LA
Yeah.
or 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 Florida more accurately with the humidity,
Hmm.
or like Kunming, like the capital of Yunnan province, or Hong Kong. There's two major places of pu'er aging. And so when you buy a cake, you buy, for the genetics, the maker, the origin. And so this is definitely where you get into like the terroir language, and you kind
Yeah.
of see
This
parallels
makes
there.
me think of whiskey and rum. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
I'm
a
the
totally
same.
different thing, but
Yeah.
also you've got these different elements of the materials you start with, where it's aged, how it's aged. You give less
Yeah.
of an angel share, for example, in Northern Europe than you do in Jamaica, right? And so your rums age much more quickly than like a Scotch whiskey would. So similar, I guess, in some ways, to how the tea is aging based on also ambient temperature,
Uh,
humidity. Yeah.
yeah, well, and I forgot to mention this part. Yeah, so it's one of my favorite categories. It's one that it's so old and has such value today that, I've always been inspired by Nina Atkins' work,
Hmm.
and an ethnobotanist that passed too young. And her work is really just amazing. It's definitely made an impact on me. Um, but her book, Eating on the Wild Side, and
Yeah.
the first chapter, The Call of the Wild, just captivated me. And the spectrum of wild to cultivated in food and medicine, and that it's a continuum, both. I mean, and that whole conversation. And pu'er was one of those teas that is always a playground in my mind, because a lot of Selena Ahmed's work looks at pu'er growing in Yunnan province,
Mhm.
and uh, looking at this. So the landscapes of how the tea is grown in southern Yunnan is different from Assam and from Darjeeling and Kenya and areas of major tea production around the world, and even East China. And it's really unique. It's the birth. It comes from the birthplace of tea. There's a kind of a
Yeah.
belt that genetic kind of belt in Southeast Asia, and then the cultivation it moved up and over into China, and we're having this tea come out of that area, and it's
Yeah.
grown in still a very unique, very beautiful way. And it's always something that's fascinating. But then you look at the recent history of the last few hundred years, and it it over the tea horse road is a relatively new thing in the timeline of tea, and that came and went, and now you have air freight around the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the product is hung on and has evolved, and there are people that have talked about this. And I've been to southern Yunnan, I've been to northern Laos, I've seen it grow, I've had it, I've had it cooked, I've had it brewed, I've had it
Mhm.
stewed. And it's one of those things that you know you can eat leaves of different types too. I've had it in Japan, I've had it in Eastern China. You can eat tea leaves, you can, in different various ways, you can ferment them. So you
Yeah.
have tea go from a beverage, a food, and a tonic, and a medicine, and then a beverage, and a beverage in so many different forms, more than any of those other categories on the spectrum. So I
Amazing.
really like this beverage to one bring people together, to caffeinate the world, and also fit into all of these different things. So are the categories just self-inflicted? Like, do we need boxes to put it in, or can it just be what it is in front of us?
All these different. Well, okay, I have to take this opportunity to ask you for some advice because I'll be in Japan this month,
Wow.
and I'm going to be visiting the matcha growing kind of area outside of Kyoto. And so
Really? Yeah.
maybe could you tell me what is matcha before I get there? And what should I be looking out for? I mean, I'm just being fully honest here because I am not a tea expert. And as we just learned, there are many, many forms of tea. So what is
Sure.
matcha? And as a biocultural collections expert, what types of objects might I want to look out for on this trip? Because the things that are available today are going to perhaps be rare in the future. And so maybe I should pick up some things for our own kind of herbarium and small biocultural collection.
Yeah. Well, know that tea moved to Japan from China,
Hmm.
not the culture of tea. So at the time, powdered tea was all the rage in China, and that tradition moved with monks and spirituality to Japan. And then China really changed its form to being whole leaf teas.
Mhm.
And Japan really stuck to the whole powdered tea and evolved that culture over the last few hundred years um, into being tea as we know it today. So we know Japanese tea as the bright green leaves,
Yeah.
and right, and compared to many Chinese teas that are more of an emerald or darker. So
Mhm.
that's going into like that firing step I mentioned. So when you put dry heat, or you flash fire it in a wok
Mhm.
to kill the enzyme, you are going to give it like a nuttiness. The leaf is, you're going to get like a caramelized, right, like a fired caramel. In Japan, the bright green, the technique that's that's most common is steam firing. So it
Okay.
doesn't take long. They're using a wet heat, and that's what gives you the bright color.
Mhm.
So you have to know that steaming and dry firing are both used in both countries,
Okay.
but China is more known for dry fire, and Japan's more known for wet fire.
That makes sense to me because they also have, I mean, another thing I'll be doing while I'm there is checking out the onsen where you have all the steam, hot springs and, they steam and wet heat their people too, in
Yeah,
addition
and
to the plants, which I'm very much
well,
looking forward to.
and you'll and the sushi and everything else. So
Yeah.
so when you steam fire leaf, it's giving you oceanic, it's giving you salty, it's giving you
Mm.
briny. A, the palette of sushi, of the cuisines of cuisine of Japan, right?
Hmm.
So it
Yeah.
compares really well with flavors that were already enjoyed by the people of Japan. So that's why it's amazing when you see a plant spread, or the diaspora of a plant going around the world. It
Yeah. How it fits within
How it
these
fits,
different,
which
yeah.
one, if you're a coffee or a tea culture, often, or other caffeinated plant, economics plays a huge part of that, but also flavor too,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
which types and everything else. And there's a few variables, but in Japan, the powdered stock and these flavor profiles of this type of green tea stock. So the main tea is a whole leaf, is a leaf tea of sencha. You'll see that around.
Okay.
But matcha is different. It's a small part of their industry will make matcha. You're going to the best tea, historic matcha producing. Do you want me to go with you? I can help
Yeah,
out.
come along. I may end up giving you some FaceTime calls when I'm out in the fields. Like, what am I looking
Oh, take a lot.
at?
So matcha and gyokuro represent a small segment of the industry output in Japan, and
Okay.
they're both shaded teas. So they
Okay.
actually are like on post with like black tarps
Hmm.
over their bushes to simulate shade. The same tarps and things that are actually adapted for ginseng production that you
Yeah.
see in north central Wisconsin and in the ginseng fields. So you see them on slopes, they're terraced, but they're shaded to boost the chlorophyll. So what might be like a lime colored leaf will become like deep emerald
Wow.
from
Okay.
the shading. And then they pick it and they make this um, uh, processed stage of the green. And then it, I'm trying to summarize it really quickly. But they make this whole leaf a dried, why am I spacing on the word?
It's like steamed first and then it's
Yeah, it's steamed. So sorry, it's picked, wilted, steamed, and then it ends up coming up like broken, like flakes. So the
Mhm.
steaming process, and then that is what those like a dried leaf. That's what they put into a stone mill or a ball
Okay.
mill or any sort of mechanized mill, and that's what they mill down a green leaf into a green leaf powder,
Okay.
and
And then that
that is
powder, how is that consumed? So I know like with a regular cup of black tea, I would steep it and then strain it. Are you drinking the actual leaf powder in the beverage or is it strained?
Yeah, so because it's a powder, this is what makes it really unique and what made the matcha craze in America. Still now, we're still seeing it now, but certainly over the last
Mhm.
10 years or so, it's the tea that you consume. Usually you strain a leaf, you brew a leaf and you
Mhm.
strain it out and you drink the infusion, right? With matcha, you're actually whisking it into the warm water and you're drinking it whole,
Okay.
um, everything involved. So you are consuming it. So you're getting tea solids as well. So you have a different caffeine high. It lasts a
Yeah.
little bit longer. It will might be stronger. You might feel it quicker, but it does last a little bit longer. And this matcha, there's a whole matcha ceremony. This is tied intimately into their spirituality. It's a very sacred process in plant and product that they're making. Also, there's a gyokuro ceremony and a sencha ceremony. But the one that you probably will be sitting in will be the matcha ceremony,
right,
on your trip. But it is one that is whisked with a bamboo whisk in a bowl.
mm-hmm.
And there are different materials for part of each of these ceremonies. Some of them are made from plants. There's lacquerware containers, there's bamboo scoops, there's bamboo whisks. And there are, of course, a tradition and quality standards for each of these materials, and matcha bowls, of course. But it's only like an ounce or two, like a scoop of matcha, a certain amount of water that you whisk until frothy and that you consume.
That way. Okay.
So it's a completely different way of which we do it here, but America being the melting pot that it is, you see matcha and everything.
Yeah. Very different from the kind of sacred traditional consumption.
Right. We have the garden here in Missouri has a tea house island, or a tea house in the middle of our Japanese garden, in the waterway, and we open it up for our Japanese festival in the fall. We close it off during the year because it is a sacred space, and we don't want anybody to vandalize it. You don't wear shoes inside. By the way, take your shoes off.
Take my shoes off. Okay.
And it is, so so we open it up at a festival, and the lines go over the arched bridge around the pond to get into it. So it's we don't have any matcha at Q. If anybody's listening out there, if you see it in bulk and you see it anything but bright green, it's spent. You can consume it, it just won't taste that great. It doesn't have the juiciness.
Having that bright green color is important.
Yeah, and green teas are meant to be fresh, because guess what? It's a tree. There'll be a crop next year. So green teas and whites and yellows, there is a tradition of aging and doing different things with them, but generally they say drink within a year. Even if, because imagine this, we have a sensitive leaf that ages quickly. Today you can have it, you can have all of this fancy bags and airtight everything. And I've had a bag of matcha and gyokuro and never opened, in the best storage, conditions, open it up and it still doesn't have that like juiciness to it. It has a little stale. And I was like, and this is in 21st century plastic
so it's best to use it. So
there are green teas and certainly matcha. Sometimes you'll probably see it ground fresh in front of you. It can be that fresh. So you want to drink everything, and for heaven's sakes, don't put tea in glass containers in a windowsill where it cooks it in the jar. You can totally see it. You can ruin matcha within 2 weeks if it's left.
Wow. Hey, good advice, listeners. Keep it out of the sun.
I'm trying to slowly convert America to read the instructions and not do that.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I think we're about out of time. Aurora, thank you so much for sharing your incredible knowledge around teas and really important biocultural objects. And I know you're going to be here in Atlanta for the Society for Economic Botany and Society of Ethnobiology meeting. For those of you that are still considering, we have registration open until May 18th. And we also have a special field trip to a paper making museum where we're going to learn about those objects involved in paper here in Georgia. So lots to learn and explore. But thanks so much for coming on the show. It was really great to speak with you.
No problem. My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded for you today on Zoom. I want to give a big shout out of thanks to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth from Co-Conspiracy Entertainment, for putting on a great episode for us each and every week. I also want to let you know about where you can help support the show. There are a couple of things you can do. Number one is you can head over to Apple Podcasts and just click those 5 stars. and maybe leave a comment. This will help other new listeners find the program. You can also support the show through buying some swag. We have a lot of fun products available for you on mysterycontrol.com, and you can head over to the Foodie Pharmacology store there. So thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.